Today, the island of Malta is a sun-washed tourist destination in the center of the Mediterranean. Its picturesque streets, beautiful churches, and impressive fortifications attract over 3 million visitors, tourists, and cruise ship passengers per year, while its marinas are filled with yachts from all over Europe. But 5 centuries ago, the island's future hung in balance. Its language, culture, and religion faced extermination, a fate shared by so many on which the leaders of the Muslim world had set their sights. It was then, in 1565 Anno Domini, that the Great Siege of Malta took place. The events that led to the siege started when a Muslim invasion destroyed the remains of the Crusader states, capturing Acre in 1291. Among the Christian refugees from the Holy Land were the Knights of St. John, also known as the Hospitallers from their full name, the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. Looking for a new home, the Knights built their headquarters on the Greek island of Rhodes. They became seafarers and battled the Muslims on the waves of the eastern Mediterranean. Their effectiveness is best described by Islamic chroniclers themselves. Worst of those who live in error, sent by the devil and famous for cunning and artifice, outcast, accursed workers of iniquity, expert seamen and outstanding navigators. Their wickedness knows no end. The evil sect of Franks, the worst sons of error, the most corrupted of the devil's spawn. These corsairs are noted for their energy and daring. The Hospitallers' successes led to several revenge attacks on their new home. They repealed these, but could not hold out forever against the might of the Islamic world. The end came in 1522, when Rhodes fell to Muslim invaders. This time, the Ottoman Turks, led by Suleiman the Magnificent. An army 100,000 strong was landed on the island and forced the order's garrison of 7,000 to surrender after a 6-month siege. The loss of Rhodes forced the Hospitallers to look for a new home, and in 1530 they were invited to settle on Malta. Once there, they did not waste any time, and with their war galleys sailing from the island, the knights resumed their struggle to defend Christendom on the waters of the central Mediterranean. They raided Muslim shipping along the North African coast to liberate Christian slaves and obtain loot to finance their operations. They also fought the Muslim pirates who ravaged European shores, looking for captives to fill the Islamic world's slave markets, clashing with them in violent naval battles. With the Hospitallers a thorn in their side, the Barbary pirates pleaded with the ruler of the Ottoman Empire to destroy them. However, the Sultan was reluctant to send an expedition against such a distant target, especially since his experience on Rhodes showed that this enemy would be difficult to defeat. But everything changed in 1564 when the Hospitallers went too far. It was then that the Order's war galleys, under the famed Maturin de Lescaut, a French nobleman known as Romigas, captured his personal galleon loaded with the fortune in trading goods. The insult this implied forced the Sultan to act, and an invasion of Malta was ordered. During autumn and winter, extensive intelligence was collected about the island's defenses, and weapons and supplies were gathered to arm and sustain an army that would operate far from home. An army that would not only crush the Knights of St. John, but also seize Malta so it could become a base for further aggression against Christian Europe. In the spring, everything was ready, and the Turkish fleet departed Constantinople on the 22nd of March. It was a massive armada of almost 400 vessels that were carrying an army of 50,000 men. The Muslim force included 6,000 Janissaries, the elite troops of the Ottoman Empire. These were men with a tragic past, as they had been taken from Christian families in the Balkans as children, converted to Islam, and indoctrinated to fight for the religion that had stolen their lives. The Ottoman army was much greater than what the Hospitallers could muster to defend their new home. Only 8,000 men, including 582 knights, and 5,000 armed civilians were to face the Muslim invasion from the ramparts of the Order's fortifications. The impressive Fort St. Angelo at the tip of the Birgu Peninsula that was the Hospitallers' headquarters, the small Fort St. Elmo at the tip of the Sybaris Peninsula that guarded the access to the Grand Harbor, the now gone Fort St. Michel on the Sanglier Peninsula, and the city walls of Sanglier. And Birgu. Their commander was the Grand Master of the Order himself, a French nobleman named Jean Périsson de Valette. The odds were heavily set against the Hospitallers, and made even worse by the fact that the defenders were split among several locations. Because of this, the coming fight was going to be one of those legendary battles where the few stood against the many. And it was a fight that the few could not afford to lose, as the Muslim army would have no pity on its vanquished foes. Defeat could only mean death or slavery, as this was the fate of all the inhabitants of the nearby island of Gozo 14 years earlier. After the destruction of a large Christian fleet at Jerba just 5 years before the siege, there was nothing that Europeans could do to halt the approaching storm. Their naval forces still had not been rebuilt after that debacle, and were therefore too weak to stop the Ottomans. Because of this, unhindered by enemy action, the invasion force was able to cross the Mediterranean, and on the 18th of May it was off the Maltese coast, encouraged by a letter from the Sultan. "The armada joined for you is the largest ever created, the army numerous, the soldiers hand-chosen, the material more than sufficient. Nothing more is required other than courage and zeal. The Prophet will aid you in this most just war, from which you must not think to return until you have swept Malta clean, destroyed all as an example to those pirates and to the ages." On the 20th of May, the fleet anchored at Marsaxlokk on the eastern edge of the island and disembarked. This was not the best anchorage, as it was open to the sirocco wind blowing in from the south, which made the ships vulnerable to a storm. But the Ottomans did not have a better choice, because the ideal anchorage, that of Martsengsit harbor, could not be used. Hospitaller guns firing from Fort St. Elmo controlled the access to its waters, so, unless these were silenced, the invaders had to live with the threat of bad weather. It was the concern for their fleet that dictated that the Ottomans' first objective was going to be Fort St. Elmo. Although attacking the Hospitaller headquarters in Birgu right away would have made the most sense tactically, it also would have carried enormous risk. This risk being that if the fleet was lost to a storm, the army would end up stranded far from home, and the entire expedition would likely end in a disaster. The fact that Fort St. Elmo was small, isolated, and poorly designed contributed to this decision because the Ottomans thought that it would fall in no time. And once it did, with the fleet safely anchored, the army could turn its full attention to the Hospitaller headquarters. In preparation for the attack on Fort St. Elmo, 3 rows of guns were placed on the high ground of Mount Sybaris. From there, the Ottomans had excellent fields of fire and could shoot not only at the walls, but also into the interior of the Christian position. The bombardment began on 24th of May, and after just 1 day, Fort St. Elmo was heavily damaged. Forced to endure Ottoman fire while enemy engineers dug approach trenches closer and closer to their walls, the garrison wavered. The men saw their situation as hopeless and asked for permission to abandon the fort. However, Valette refused because he needed it to keep the invaders occupied. Every day, the Muslims spent trying to take the place they were not fighting where it really counted. Instead, the Grand Master sent over the first of several batches of reinforcements so the garrison could, with its blood, buy the time the order needed to survive. On the 3rd of June, Janissaries seized the fort's ravelin with a surprise attack at night. A bloody battle ensued, with Christian reinforcements rushing forth to recover the critical position while their guns provided fire support. However, the Ottomans were too many and were able to keep this prize. 3 attempts to storm the walls were beaten back in June, while reinforcements sent by Valette helped to make up the losses taken during those or inflicted by incessant fire. reinforcements that, after the 16th, consisted only of volunteers, as the Grand Master would no longer order men to what was almost a certain death. On the 18th, the invaders suffered a key loss: the pirate commander Dragut. Dragut was a slaver who was a scourge of the Christians living on the shores of the Mediterranean. His raids carried away countless captives and left behind numerous dead. Dragut was recognized as one of the most capable naval commanders of his time, and in recognition of this was made the commander of Ottoman naval forces in the Mediterranean. Despite his connection to slavery, even today he remains a celebrated figure in Turkey. Arriving on the 2nd of June, Dragut had built additional gun batteries to pummel St. Elmo and erected screens to hide those on Mount Sybaris from fire from across the harbor. Mortally injured by friendly fire, he was to die on the day the fort fell. The defenders pushed back another assault on the 21st in a brutal 7-hour battle that decimated them, left nearly all the survivors injured, and their gunpowder stores exhausted. The end was in sight, but despite that, more men, knights, soldiers, civilians, and the famous Romigas volunteered to reinforce the doomed garrison. This time, however, Valette refused, knowing that their sacrifice would not extend Fort St. Elmo's resistance much longer. Meanwhile, in the ruins, the 2 remaining friars gave the last rites to the heavily wounded and burned or buried sacred objects from their chapel so the Muslims would not be able to desecrate them. On the 23rd of June, the final attack was launched on what was by then little more than a pile of rubble and fly-covered corpses. Still, despite their exhaustion, injuries, and much reduced numbers, the last defenders of Fort St. Elmo fought hard enough to make this battle last 4 long hours. Some of them even fought while sitting in chairs, as they were too injured to stand, and others had to be killed by arquebus fire as they stood over piles of enemies they had slain. But in the end, the much more numerous Ottomans prevailed and the fort fell. Only a handful of men from the garrison survived that final battle. Several Maltese escaped by swimming across the Grand Harbor, and 9 of the defenders were spared by the corsairs who were expected to ransom their captives for money. All the rest were killed. Those that could fight died in combat, and the badly injured were cruelly murdered. This ended the heroic 4-week saga of Fort St. Elmo. With the fall of that position, the Muslims finally secured their access to Marsengset harbor, but this success had come at a heavy price. For one, while the battle cost the Hospitallers 1,500 men, the invaders lost 6,000, including some of their very best. Further, disease began to ravage the army, weakening the men and slowing the recovery of the wounded. Because of this, in the coming weeks, the Ottomans were going to start aiming their support personnel to flesh out the ranks, even though that diluted the quality of their combat units. Although the same applied to the Hospitallers, who had to rely more and more on the civilians in Birgu and Senglia to help them man the walls. Fortunately for the defenders, before the next assault came, over 500 men, knights and soldiers from the army gathering on Sicily, reinforced the garrison. Lastly, the fighting cost the Muslims precious time, during which Christian reinforcements gathered in Sicily. 3 weeks passed before the Muslims were to assault the Hospitaller positions once again, and this time their target was the Senglia Peninsula. This was to be a 2-pronged attack, with one force coming by boat across the Grand Harbor, and another attacking from the south. However, the Hospitallers were ready, and thanks to reinforcements coming across a floating bridge, they defeated one amphibious force on Senglia's beach, destroyed another with point-blank fire from a gun battery, and their landward fortifications halted the southern assault. "Pay for St. Elmo! Pay for St. Elmo, you bastards!" was what the survivors of the amphibious force heard when they tried to surrender after their attack collapsed and they were left stranded on the beach. Having seen what the Muslims had done to the wounded defenders of Fort St. Elmo, left the men without any mercy. Sustained artillery fire followed the failed attack, and on the 7th of August, the Ottomans tried again. This time, the weakened defenses cracked, and Muslim forces penetrated into the key position of the post of Castile. This was a dark moment and may have spelled the beginning of the end for the weakened garrison. However, just then, the Ottoman attack collapsed and their troops withdrew. Unbeknownst to Valette, this was because a raid by Christian cavalry from Medina had hit the enemy's camp. The cavalrymen had been operating aggressively from that city throughout the siege and clashing successfully with small enemy parties foraging in the countryside. Despite the threat these men posed, the Ottomans failed to provide security for their camp, leaving it completely unprotected. Thanks to this, the raiders were able to enter it, finding nothing but the wounded and the support personnel. A massacre ensued, and this caused the attack on Birgu to be called off. After the raid from Medina, the Muslims realized that leaving the city alone had been a mistake, so they sent a force to seize it. However, that force's commander turned back when he saw the dense ranks of defenders lining its walls. He did not realize that these were mostly civilians, dressed up to look like soldiers. Another large assault followed in late August. This one also breached the Christian lines and was only thrown back by a counterattack led personally by the order's 71-year-old Grandmaster. After this, disheartened and having lost much of his army to combat and disease, the Muslim commander ordered a return home. However, this was not yet the end, as while the Ottomans were embarking their artillery on their ships, the Christian relief force landed in the north. 9,600 strong, the army commanded by Garcia Alvarez de Toledo y Osorio, the Spanish viceroy of Sicily, consisted mainly of Italians and Spaniards who had been waiting for this opportunity for months. The relief force marched south, and the Muslims, confident in their greater numbers, moved to engage it, hoping for a victory that could, perhaps, break the Hospitallers' morale. While to the south, Valette had his men plant the Hospitallers' flag on the ruins of Fort St. Elmo once more. The Ottomans deployed on high ground where the Christians charged them, and despite their greater numbers, the Muslims were pushed back. Too many of their best fighters were dead, while the Christians were all experienced soldiers, experienced and eager for battle. To avenge Fort St. Elmo, to avenge Jerba, to avenge all those who had been killed or enslaved. With the troops from Medina joining it, Don Garcia's army drove the Ottomans into the sea. Muslim warships provided fire support to the routed army, while boats came to the shore to rescue the survivors. The scene on the beach was hellish, with the noise of the naval guns, overloaded boats capsizing, and water turning pink with the blood of the dead. 1,500 Muslims died that day, and another 1,500 were enslaved, while only 25 Christians were lost. When the smoke cleared and the survivors of the Ottoman invasion force sailed home, the Great Siege of Malta was over.